Hello and a very warm welcome back to the garden. So the other day I had a comment and someone said, how do I keep the garden so clean without any weeds? Now whilst I do appreciate that compliment, there are weeds in this garden. Like here, here, here and here. In fact, there are always going to be weeds. However, there are some great things that you can do to reduce weed pressure. And from my understanding, what my viewer left as a comment had more of an underlying tone of how do I not let weeds get out of hand. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you how to do in this video. Whilst you could always attempt to train a chicken to do some weeding. What did you do? You ate the carrots. No, this is my weed. Stop eating the carrots. No dinner for you tonight. Poor carrots. It makes more sense to instead look at what causes an overwhelming number of weeds to appear. And for me, there are two things that stand out the most. From my experience, I found that the biggest reason for a ton of weeds to suddenly appear is from excessive soil disturbance. And the second reason coming from neglect. Now, if you don't already know, I garden using the fundamentals of no dig as my foundation. Now with no dig, the idea is instead of forking or digging in your organic matter, what you do is you spread it over the surface and let nature do the rest of the work. And by keeping soil disturbance to a minimum, there are fewer weeds. But how exactly does this happen? In front of me here, I have a row of daikon radish that I've sown directly into the ground. Now, the ground or the soil is a natural seed bank. It's full of seeds that are waiting to germinate when the right conditions present themselves. So if you dig or you turn over the soil, what you're doing is you're bringing the seed bank of weed seeds up towards the surface, which can then trigger them to sprout. When you dig, you also damage the structure of the soil. And nature's way of repairing either damaged soil or bare soil is by growing plants, and this tends to mean growing weeds. So you can think of plants as being nature's plaster or band-aid, but not the Bob Geldof type of band-aid. It's no coincidence that respecting your soil leads to fewer issues, and a reduced weed pressure is just one of the multiple benefits that you get from following principles based around no-dig gardening. As I mentioned earlier, one of the other core reasons for a ton of weeds appearing is from neglect. Now, I know how easy it is to forget about the garden during autumn and winter, and this is when a lot of the weeds can really take hold, and then at the first whiff of warm spring air they seem to turn into triffids, and that's a really demoralising way to start your growing season. Now, there's also another type of neglect that can happen through the growing season, and I'm going to give you a prime example right now. In front of me here is the strawberry bed, which I have neglected. I've been so invested in all of the annual plants, especially at this time of year, it's really easy to forget about the perennials. But I just want to show you that not everything needs to be perfect. I can come through and in 10-15 minutes, this whole bed will be completely weed free. I think it's about just doing things to the best of our abilities, given the time that we have to garden. Now, during the season, there's a particular strategy that I follow that I feel makes the biggest impact when it comes to reducing neglect and keeping on top of the weeds. Think of weeding like washing dishes. If we wash our dishes regularly, we will always keep on top of them and not feel overwhelmed by the chore. However, if we let that dirty dish pile build up and we find ourselves using something like a tablespoon to stir your coffee, then it's an obvious sign that things have got out of hand, and there's no denying that every time you enter the kitchen, you immediately met with that big pile of dishes looming and crying out for them to be cleaned. Now in a garden, if you let the weeds build up, you'll then notice every time that you come into the garden that it's weedy and a little bit overrun. And is that really how you want to feel when you enter the garden? Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes if there's a big pile of dishes, I do everything I physically can to avoid going to the kitchen, just so I'm not faced with a pile of dishes. And you don't really want that feeling when it comes to gardening, because a garden is my escape. I don't want to be met with that kind of overwhelm of weeds. The worst thing about keeping on top of weeds is that it requires discipline. Now, if you're anything like me, I was one of those students who would always leave their homework until last minute, because that was when I was most motivated to deal with it. So because of that, any kind of chore can be a bit of an uphill battle. What changed it for me was getting a volunteer. You missed a bit. Was turning, or looking at how I could turn the mundane job of weeding into something a little bit more enjoyable. So firstly, I had to think about what is the reward. So the primary reward of weeding is that you end up with kind of pristine looking beds that you can feel proud of. And for me, that's enough of a motivation. But what I also like to do is, if I've got a bit of time, I like to listen to a podcast or an audiobook as I'm doing a bit of weeding, because then I feel like I'm getting more done in the exact same time. So if you're one of those people who like that kind of feeling of productivity, or trying to distract you from the process of weeding, then I highly recommend trying that. I think you all know what I'm going to say when it comes to dealing with weeds, and it needs a little and often approach, say once every week or every couple of weeks. But what you need to do is to kind of make it fun, make it exciting. Mark off a time on the calendar, get yourself an audio book, make sure you've got a nice flask of tea, cup of coffee, some cake, maybe invite a friend over, and just turn it into a bit of a tradition. So instead of seeing it as a must-do chore that you try and get out of the way, turn it into an opportunity to perhaps have a bit of a social, and then suddenly you won't kind of dread that feeling of having to weed your garden quite as much, and it's just going to give you even more opportunity to really enjoy the space that you have. Now, when it comes to neglect over autumn and winter, there's one thing that you can do that will make the biggest difference, and that's by putting your raised beds to sleep, so you're not met with a load of weeds at the start of the growing season. I've got a complete guide, a video just up here, showing you exactly how to prepare your raised beds for winter. Now, I hope this video has shown you how no day can make a really big impact in terms of reducing weed pressure and reducing the amount of weeds. And just remember to turn it into something fun and take that little and often approach. And it may not be perfect, but it's definitely going to de-stress you to enjoy much of the growing season.